Tonight, we drift through parchment and candlelight, through empty pews and endless rehearsals, through a world where music was more than melody. It was a burden, a breath, a battle. We are not walking through fame. There is no spotlight in this story. No thunderous applause, just a man with ink-stained fingers and too little sleep, composing by instinct, teaching by necessity, praying for provision. This is the exhausting life of Johann Sebastian Bach, not the genius you hear about in concert halls, but the tired father, the church employee, the son who buried both parents before his voice had even settled, the boy who walked miles to study organ, the man who wrote cantatas in morning clothes. His life was not grand, it was relentless. But somewhere in the shadows of his routine, in the hours nobody watched, he built cathedrals out of notes. And though he never saw the world celebrate him, the sound never stopped. So lie back, close your eyes, let the candle flicker in the back of your mind, and let's begin the quiet story of the man who gave the world music while barely keeping his own life in tune. The boy with too many notes and no parents. 500 words he was born into sound. Not silence, not peace. The Bach family had music in their marrow. Every uncle, cousin, grandfather, men who tuned their lives to strings and keys. So when Johann was born in 1685, it was not surprising that he reached for the harpsichord before he could write his name. But what is rarely told is how quickly the sound was swallowed by grief. He was just 9 when his mother died. Just months later, his father followed. 2 burials, 2 coffins, 1 boy left behind. The house didn't echo anymore, not with laughter, not with lessons. Just footsteps on wooden floors, and the quiet ache of growing up too fast. They sent him to his eldest brother's home. Another Bach, another musician, but different, stern, disciplined, the kind who loved rules more than rhythm. His brother gave him a room, a roof, and a rigid education. The harpsichord was allowed, but not all pieces. Some music was kept locked away in a cabinet. Too difficult, too advanced, too sacred to touch. Johann waited until the candles were low and the house asleep. He copied those forbidden pieces by moonlight, page after page, hours at a time. The ink faded. His eyesight strained, but the notes burned into his mind. He memorized them before they were even dry. In those quiet hours, while others dreamed of comfort, he dreamed of sound. Not for fame, not for praise, just for the shape of the thing, the logic and beauty of each measure. His fingers were small, his hands clumsy, but his ears were sharp and the ache in his chest. He poured that into melody. He didn't cry often, not even after the burials, but when he sat at the clavichord, he let the sadness speak for him. The notes didn't ask him to explain, they just took what he gave. The church called it devotion. The town called it talent. But to him, it was just survival. A way to speak without being asked how he felt. A way to feel without breaking apart. He wasn't yet the master, not yet the father or the cantor or the composer. Just a boy with a hole in his world and music too large to keep inside. He never stopped writing after that, even when his hands ached, even when the ink froze, because something had been lost too early, and the only way he could hold on to anything was to write it down before it left him too. Sleepless in the choir loft, he left his brother's house before the walls could finish closing in. His voice had begun to settle by then. Not quite a man's yet, not quite a boy's either, but strong enough to carry the high notes across a chapel. He was sent to sing. That was the exchange. Room, board, and the chance to study. If he would climb the narrow steps to the choir loft and lend his voice to God. The steps creaked under him each morning before the sun. Before the frost had lifted from the windows, he carried no complaints. Only a blanket wrapped too thin and a book of psalms that smelled of dust. The loft was always cold. His breath fogged the air as he sang. Sometimes he sang on an empty stomach, sometimes on aching legs from walking long distances between lessons. But he always sang, not for applause, not even for faith, just because it was the only way anyone would let him stay. The master who trained the choir had a sharp hand and sharper ears. If a note wavered, the cane followed. If a boy coughed, he was replaced. No one argued, no one dared. Johann never missed his part. He could sing in Latin before he could afford new shoes. He memorized entire motets while washing his only tunic in cold water. But what he didn't learn in voice, he learned in silence. He learned how to listen, to hear the way music lived inside stone, how it bounced from beam to beam, how it lingered just a second longer in the corners. No one looked. And when the others were dismissed, when the benches emptied and the candles flickered low, he sometimes stayed behind. Saturday, alone in the loft, let his breath return to normal, let the hush settle around him, and he would hum, just softly, little lines of melody that didn't belong to the mass. Little fragments that rose from somewhere deeper. No one knew he did it. He never told because it wasn't for anyone else. It was his secret language, his only place to speak. The pews below looked so far away from up there. The world looked smaller, the worries quieter, and though he didn't have a father anymore, didn't have the warmth of a kitchen or the sound of his mother's voice, he had the loft, he had the music. And some nights, when he had no place else to sleep, he stayed there, curled under a stolen cloak, beside a cracked window surrounded by air that still carried the scent of wax and wood. The bells would ring in the morning, the boys would return, and he would be ready, eyes tired, voice steady, still there, still climbing the steps, still singing, because it was the only way forward, because no one ever told him how to stop. When hunger Saturday beside the harpsichord, it came slowly at first, just a faint lightness behind the eyes, a dull ache in the gut that faded when the music started. But then it didn't fade. Then it sat with him, stayed beside him as he played, as he copied. As he walked past the bakery without coin in his pocket, hunger was not dramatic, not the kind that cried out or doubled him over. It was quieter than that. It made his fingers slow on the keys. It made the air feel heavier. It made him stare too long at crumbs left behind on a pew bench. He did not beg. He did not ask. The pride that had kept him upright in the choir loft would not bend now. Instead, he waited for bread after rehearsal, waited for a look from a steward, waited to be noticed. Often he was not. The other boys sometimes whispered about him, said he worked too hard, said he stayed too long at the keys, but they didn't see how the music helped him forget, how a full page of manuscript meant one less hour spent hearing his stomach turn, how a long fugue could carry him far away from the scent of someone else's supper. There was a chapel servant who noticed once, a woman with hands always dusted in flour. She left half a roll wrapped in cloth beside the organ stool, never spoke of it, never looked at him when he found it. But she did it again the next week, and the next it was never much, but it was enough. Enough to keep him upright when his vision blurred, enough to remind him that someone saw him. Even when no one spoke his name at the harpsichord, his hunger became rhythm. He didn't play with fire. He played with restraint, with the control of a boy trying not to shake. The notes came measured, balanced, clean. Even when his body trembled, the music did not. He began to compose in that season little pieces, simple lines, not for anyone else to hear, just to keep his mind steady, just to give shape to the day. Because when the bell rang and the benches filled and the food never came, he still had something of his own, even if it could not. He learned early that genius would not fill your bowl, that work would not always be rewarded, that talent was a heavy cloak when you had no shoes. But he also learned that the hunger passed more gently when the hands were busy. And so he played, he copied. He stayed at the keys long after the others left. He knew the sound of his stomach better than he knew his own voice, but he never let it interrupt the music. That was the rule. That was the rhythm. The body could wait. The notes could not. The long road to Lübeck and the organ that waited, he didn't ask permission. He just walked. 200 miles on foot. Across frozen ground, past towns that blurred together, through woods that whispered in unfamiliar dialects. He had no map, only direction. No certainty, only longing. Lübeck was waiting, not the city, not the buildings, but the man who played the organ there, Dieterich Buxtehude, a name he had copied in the corners of his own pages, a sound he had imagined when his fingers ran out of room on the keys back home. He needed to hear it for himself. He needed to know if what he dreamed was real. The road did not welcome him. It punished him, with winds that pressed like hands against his chest, with boots that blistered and cracked and filled with snow. But he kept moving. Nights were spent beneath barns and against church doors. Some farmers turned him away. One gave him broth. He said nothing in return, just nodded and kept walking. The weeks passed. His shoes thinned. His legs ached. But when he finally reached the tall spires and the bell towers of Lübeck, he stood still in the street and let the cold settle inside his coat one last time. The church was larger than he imagined, its doors swollen with age. Inside, the ceiling's sword-like breath held too long. He did not speak to Buxtehude that first day. He sat in the back pew and listened. The sound filled the stones, filled him. It was not just music, it was a language, not of words, but of weight. The kind of weight that pressed against the ribs and asked nothing except that you feel it fully. He watched the old man's fingers, how they curved like smoke over the keys. He didn't move with speed. He moved with certainty. Each chord stretched into the rafters and refused to fade. Bach stayed for months, long after anyone expected him back. His job was waiting, his duties left behind. But this was more important here. He could ask questions no one had answered. Why a line resolved the way it did. Why silence mattered more than tempo. Why the best melodies came after everyone else had gone to bed. He studied by watching, by copying, by returning. Again and again to the same pew, the same keys, the same aching. Buxtehude never scolded him, never turned him away. He saw something in the boy, or maybe just remembered being young himself. And when Bach finally left, when he turned his face back toward the road and wrapped his scarf against the wind again, he did not leave the same way he came. He carried the sound now deep in the bones, deep in the hands. It was not fame that he had walked for. It was understanding. And though he returned broke-tired and reprimanded, he had seen something few ever do. The organ had spoken, and he had listened. Copying music by moonlight, while the candles burned low, he returned to rules, to obligations, to pews that creaked in protest and choir masters who frowned when he lingered too long in improvisation. They didn't care what he had heard in Lübeck. They cared that he was late, that he had abandoned his post for something as vague as inspiration. But he said little in his defense. He bowed. He nodded. He took the reprimand like cold rain. Then he went back to work. Nights became his again. The daylight was too busy with others' demands. But once the doors were locked, and the footsteps faded, and the bell above the gate stopped echoing, he would light the stub of a candle and return to his desk. It wasn't a desk, really, just a rough plank beneath a crooked window. but it held his ink. It held his hunger for sound. He copied music until his wrists went numb, until the wax slid down the taper in long, quiet drips, until the light grew so dim he had to press his face close to the parchment just to read the notes. He copied everything: chorales, fugues, aria fragments overheard in the market, anything that caught in his ear and refused to leave. He rewrote them not to steal, but to learn, to understand how the scaffolding held up the beauty, how a single line could lean into another and form a tower. Sometimes his fingers smudged the ink before it dried. Sometimes he pricked them on the quill's splintering edge. But he didn't stop, because no one would teach him like that. Not here. Not now. He was his own tutor, his own critic, his own archivist in the quiet hours before dawn. He kept the pages hidden, not because he was ashamed, but because there were too many people eager to call it a waste of time. He didn't need their opinions. He needed the silence. He needed the repetition. He needed the slow, aching rhythm of transcription that calmed the storms in his chest. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the only sound was the scratch of his pen and the breath he held every time he turned to a fresh page. Some nights, the candle gave out before the music did. Then he sat in darkness, waiting for the scent of melted wax to fade, waiting for the ache behind his eyes to ease. And then he slept, head on the pages, fingers still curled, dreams filled with notes he hadn't yet written. No one praised those pages, no one saw them, but they were his. A record of obsession, of devotion, of loneliness spelled out in 16th notes and bass lines. And long after the world would forget what he looked like, those pages would still speak, still breathe, still carry the voice of a man who once sat alone in a cold room, copying music by moonlight while everyone else was asleep, court musician, royal demands, and a salary that never came. The pages he copied in the dark eventually caught the wrong kind of light. Someone noticed, someone who wore velvet and smelled like coins. A court needed music, and they needed someone who could make it sound expensive. He didn't ask questions. He accepted the post. A salary was promised. Rooms with windows, a harpsichord that didn't rattle. At first it felt like air after a long descent underwater. They called him Master Bach. They poured wine when he played. They asked for dances, for overtures, for music that filled halls with the illusion of elegance. He gave it to them, wrote on command, performed when summoned, smiled through exhaustion. But the salary didn't arrive. It always seemed to be on its way, always delayed, always spoken of like a gift rather than a wage. His coat wore thin again. His shoes remembered the shape of the road, and still they asked for more. A wedding piece for someone he had never met. A birthday suite for a prince who would not sit through it. Music became a currency he could not spend. Every measure cost him time he didn't have. Food he couldn't afford, sleep he was never granted. And yet he wrote. Not out of loyalty, not out of gratitude, but because stopping would have meant something inside him had gone silent. And he feared that more than poverty he stayed up after the banquets, after the applause, after the doors closed, and the torches guttered out in the halls. He sat in his quarters and rewrote what he had played earlier that night, fixing the places he was forced to rush, smoothing the sections no one noticed had faltered. It mattered to him even if it didn't matter to them. One morning he awoke to find the harpsichord gone, moved for another guest, just a note left behind, saying he would be given access again when it was convenient. He said nothing, just stared at the space where the instrument had stood, where his hands had last rested. He walked the length of the empty room 3 times. Then he sat down and began writing with no sound to guide him. He heard it all in his mind, every chord, every mistake, every resolution. The music obeyed him, even when the court did not. Even pride wears down. When months passed and the money still did not come, he stopped bowing, stopped smiling, stopped waiting at the edge of rooms for someone to remember. He existed. They began calling him difficult, arrogant, impatient. But he was just tired of weaving beauty for people who only saw wallpaper. And one day, without ceremony, he packed his manuscripts into a cloth bag, laced his shoes, and walked out of the gates. No farewell, no final chord, just the quiet sound of steps on stone and the memory of music trailing behind him like smoke. The day he was locked in a room for composing too much, he had barely been gone a week before another post found him. A Kapellmeister wanted a new sound. Something bold, something clever. Something that made people sit up straighter in their chairs without knowing why. Bach arrived with little more than his bag of manuscripts and his stubborn silence. He bowed once, played once, and was hired. The music came fast, too fast. He wrote morning through evening. He didn't stop to flatter. He didn't wait for feedback. He composed for orchestras that didn't exist yet, for choirs that couldn't keep up. And while the patrons applauded, his colleagues grumbled. The notes were too hard, the tempo too quick, the harmonies too strange. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He was writing for something no one could see yet, something truer than applause. But envy walks quieter than praise. It comes with smiles and silence, until one morning he entered the chapel and found the organ locked. A steward stood there with folded arms and said only that orders had been given. Bach asked no questions. He turned to leave. That afternoon, the guards came, no warning, no accusations. Just a knock and the dull clink of a key. They locked him in a room at the edge of the court. No window, no candle, just a bench and a door that didn't open again for 4 weeks. They called it reflection, a lesson in humility, but to him it was just another room. And he was used to small rooms, used to silence. He paced for the first few hours, then sat, then paced again. But on the third day he began to hum, just a little, a fragment, a theme. It returned to him again that night. He tapped it on the floor with his heel. He sang it under his breath. He composed it fully in his mind by the 7th day. There was no pen, no parchment, so he memorized it. Backward and forward, inside out. By the time they let him out, he had written 6 pieces in his head, one for each day of captivity, one for the bitterness that sat in his throat like stone. He never played those pieces in that town. He left before the next winter, quiet again, unmoved again. But the music stayed. It always did. Composing too much had never been the problem, only that he did it in places too small to hold it. So he walked on, with no bitterness in his posture, no explanation, just the memory of a locked door and the strange freedom that came when no one could hear him but himself. Every son with a name to carry and a future to pay for. He didn't speak of the room again. Not to friends, not to students, not even to his wife. He returned to work as though silence had never swallowed him. But something in him shifted. He no longer waited to be invited. He built what he needed with his own hands. A family came, 1 child, then another, then more. Each with eyes too familiar, each with a cry that pulled him from his manuscripts, from his music, from whatever quiet space he had managed to build. He named them carefully, names that echoed his own. You must not suffer for the keys, for the candles, for the coins that never arrived. So he taught them. At first through lullabies, then through scales, then through the pages he had once copied by moonlight. His sons grew fast, some faster than he wanted, and with each one the line between father and tutor blurred. He corrected with the same hands that once comforted. He demanded precision from fingers still too soft for rigor. They loved him, feared him, played for him, but they also watched him, saw the ink on his wrists, the sleep in his eyes, the music that chased him even into dreams. And somewhere along the way, they began to carry it too, not because they were asked. In the way bread was served, in the way the table held both supper and unfinished compositions. When one son left to find his own post, Bach stood in the doorway longer than expected, not waving, just watching, wondering if the world would be kinder to the next generation. He wanted them to be better, freer, heard. But even that hope had weight. Every child born under his roof inherited the silence he had swallowed for years. The hunger, the rejection, the unseen hours spent turning pain into melody. He did not hide it. He simply passed it on without meaning to. Some thrived, some faded, some left music behind entirely. But none escaped it fully, because every time they opened a door, they heard a phrase he had written. Every time they sat at the clavier, their fingers reached instinctively for something he had touched. And so the house grew louder, with lessons, with arguments, with prayers, with progressions that began to shift from his voice into theirs. He did not stop composing, but now when he wrote, he sometimes paused to listen. To the boy in the next room working out a new line, to the child downstairs humming the wrong rhythm, and he smiled just slightly, because even if the world forgot his name again, his sons would carry it forward in music, in memory, in the quiet, tireless way only a Bach could. Coffee, sickness, and the Leipzig headache. Leipzig came not with a crown, but with a headache. He took the position because the others said no. He was not their first choice, not even their second. Just the man who could not be ignored forever. The title sounded heavy enough to matter. Thomas Cantor. But behind it were schoolboys who whispered during rehearsal and a council who measured notes in silver, not spirit. He carried it anyway. All of it, the schedule, the expectations, the weight of silence when no one applauded after a week's worth of work. Mornings came early, even earlier when the sickness started. Not his. His wife's, her skin lost colour. Her appetite vanished. But she stayed upright for the sake of the children, for the dignity of being needed. Bach watched her in fragments, between lessons, between compositions, between church services where the sermon lasted longer than the music. He began drinking coffee. He had once called it a luxury. Now it became something closer to survival. A bitter cup that cleared the fog just long enough to copy another cantata, just long enough to pretend the headaches weren't getting worse. Leipzig had rules, expectations. They wanted music that fit neatly into a box. He gave them boxes full of brilliance, too brilliant, too complex. They said it confused the choir. They said it exhausted the congregation. But he wrote anyway, not to please them, to endure them. The walls of his study grew narrower. The ink stained deeper into his fingertips. The sleep became shorter. He wrote through colds, through complaints, through the moment his wife fainted near the bread oven, and no one knew what to say. Music was not joy then. It was resistance. It was defiance. He set scripture to notes not because he wanted to preach, but because it was the only way to speak without being interrupted. The city praised him in public, then reprimanded him in private. Too many notes, too many demands, too much of him. But they didn't take the title. They just made it harder to carry. Still he woke. Still he composed. Still he sat through meetings where men with softer hands questioned his methods. He smiled, just slightly, the same smile he gave to empty rooms when no one showed up for rehearsal. He knew what they didn't. That greatness was rarely obvious when it arrived. That exhaustion did not make the music less sacred. That sometimes the most beautiful sound is the one that no one claps for. The coffee stayed warm on his desk. The headaches stayed longer in his temples. But so did the music, it always did, because Leipzig was never the reward. It was the test, and he had never written for comfort. He had always written to survive. Sundays were never days of rest. He had once believed Sundays were sacred, that they held silence, that they offered something close to peace. But in Leipzig, Sundays came fast and loud, and without apology he composed for them. Prepared boys who had not slept well. Oversaw tuning, reviewed texts handed down at the last moment. There was no space for awe, no time for reflection, just motion. He would wake while the street still slept, the city's roofs dusted in frost, his breath visible inside the room, his ink cold in the pot. The cantata had to be ready before the bells rang. Not ready in thought, ready in form. Choirs rehearsed it once, maybe twice, then performed it in a sanctuary filled with eyes that stared more at the preacher than the pulpit's music stand. And still he gave them his best. Not because they deserved it, because God did. That was how he saw it. Work as devotion, effort as offering. But it cost him. His back bent more each week. His voice frayed from guiding boys who would rather be any. Some Sundays he played on an empty stomach. Others he forgot to eat altogether. The hours blurred. The prayers echoed in rooms he would clean himself when no one else did. His sons helped when they could, carrying pages. Holding lanterns, turning parchment when the wind slipped through the stained glass seams. But even they knew their father was fading. Not in spirit, in body. He smiled less on Sundays, not from bitterness. From where? It was hard to rejoice when you hadn't slept in days. Hard to sing when the notes on the page reminded you of the funeral you attended just 3 nights before. One of the young sopranos lost to fever. They sang anyway, because grief did not cancel service. Because mourning too had a melody. After the performance, the pews emptied. The gowns rustled past him. The ministers nodded politely, then left. He remained, gathering the scattered sheets, smoothing them out where someone had stepped on them. He never blamed them. Most had never known what it was to live for sound, to be kept awake by it, to be held together by its shape. He folded the music back into his coat, blew out the candle near the altar, and walked home slowly, boots dragging in dirt he barely noticed. Inside, his wife waited. Quiet again, pale again, the table laid, the bread modest, but warm he sat, gave thanks with a voice that trembled from use, and then he ate slowly, reverently, not for flavour, for strength, because Sunday would come again and again and again, and he would rise, and he would write, and he would offer the one thing he had never stopped believing in, not rest, not recognition, music that did not ask to be applauded, only played. Writing for the glory of God and to feed 13 mouths, the plate was never full enough, not with 13 mouths waiting. Some of them laughed while they chewed. Some of them didn't speak at all. One always ate too fast, another too slow. But they were all his, and they all needed him to keep writing. He didn't speak of the pressure. He just measured flour more carefully. He watched the candle stubs before buying more wax. He composed between requests for shoes and ink and new strings for the violin someone had dropped down the stairs. The music came as it always had, but now it wore responsibility heavier than it used to. He no longer wrote for curiosity. He wrote for bread, for rent, for the boots that would survive the winter. He did not resent it, but it changed something in the notes. They grew tighter, less ornamental, more exact. There was no room for indulgence when every page was measured in meals. The children did not understand it fully. They saw only that their father kept working, that his quill moved when theirs were still, that his eyes were red even at breakfast. The boys mimicked his posture. The girls kept their questions short. His wife kept the accounts and never complained when there was not enough to cover all that was due. She made soup last longer than it should. She turned threadbare into wearable, and when he thanked her, she simply nodded and told him to finish what he was writing. He tried to give them joy when he could. A new piece played softly at supper, a melody tucked into the chores, a joke muttered under his breath when one child refused to practice. But more often than not, the air was tired. Even laughter felt like work. He began taking commissions he once would have ignored, wrote music for men he did not respect, said yes when every part of him said no, because the money came faster, because the mouths at home did not stop kneading. One winter they ran out of firewood. He burned old drafts, pages from his youth, music no one had heard but him. It kept them warm for one night, and then he wrote more, always more. His fingers cracked from the cold, his knees, but his back never curled inward. He stayed upright for them. For the glory of God, he said, but also for the bakery down the street, for the butcher who gave credit, for the child who outgrew his coat again. It was not martyrdom, it was life. And when he finished a cantata and handed it over, he didn't wait to hear if it was received well. He turned, walked back, lit a fresh candle and began again, because the house needed it, because the silence could not afford to last, because music, for him, had always been both offering and answer, both heaven and hunger. When his eyes betrayed him, but the music wouldn't leave, he began noticing it during evening rehearsals. The page blurred, the notes looked thinner than before. He blinked once, twice. Moved the candle closer. It didn't help. He told no one. Not at first, he knew what it meant. A musician's eyes were not just for reading, they were for remembering, for correcting, for catching what others missed, and his had always served him faithfully, until now he started rewriting things larger, stopped composing late at night, not out of fatigue, out of fear he would misplace something precious in the dark. Still, the music came. It always did. But now it came in waves, sometimes soft, sometimes overwhelming. He would hum a line, then forget where it was meant to go. He would write a phrase, then realize he'd already written it before. He did not panic, he adjusted. He spoke his compositions aloud, taught his sons to not only play but transcribe. They would sit beside him while he dictated, voice even, hands resting on the worn arms of his chair. He could still hear everything. That part was untouched. It was the seeing that slipped gradually, cruelly. A student brought a new ink recipe once, said it would help the page stand out more. He thanked him. Used it. It did not help. Another offered to read his old works aloud to him to refresh his memory. He declined. Not out of pride, out of knowing he hadn't forgotten. The music wasn't gone. It was just locked somewhere. His eyes could no longer reach. Spring came. Then summer. He moved slower through the house, bumped into chairs that hadn't moved, missed a step he once took two at a time. And yet, when he sat at the clavier, something returned. Muscle memory, perhaps, or grace. His fingers did what his eyes could not. They searched the air and found melody, found structure, found truth. He was no longer writing for applause. He was writing to keep breathing, to prove he was still inside this body that began to betray. His family noticed, of course, quiet glances, small adjustments. A child who placed his spoon closer during supper. A daughter who no longer lit just one candle. He said nothing. They said nothing. The music said enough. One afternoon, he sat by the window with his eyes closed, listening to his youngest boy fumble through a simple exercise. He smiled, not because it was perfect, but because the child kept playing, kept going, even through the mistakes, especially through the mistakes. And in that moment, Bach knew he was not vanishing. Not really, just shifting. From page to memory, from vision to voice. From the man who once saw it all to the one who would never stop hearing. Blindness, bitterness, and the silence of forgotten notes. The day the world vanished completely was quiet. No lightning, no drama, just a soft morning, a cough that lasted too long. And then the candle beside his bed was lit for someone else to see, not him. The dark didn't come all at once. It had been arriving for years, inching forward with every measure he rewrote, every passage he squinted to finish. But now it was final, and the silence that followed was not the holy kind. It was the silence of forgotten notes, of doors that stayed closed, of invitations that stopped arriving. He was still writing, still speaking music, but fewer people cared to listen. Some said he had written too much, that he had buried his brilliance in too many lines. Others said he was difficult, demanding, stubborn. He was all of those things. But none of those things explained why the city grew louder while his name grew fainter. His students played his pieces, but not his favorites. They liked the ones that danced, not the ones that bled. And he, once the master of every room he entered, now sat in the corner like a relic. The bitterness surprised him. He had thought himself beyond it. But some days he heard one of his sons perform another man's composition and felt something sharp in his throat. Not jealousy, grief. Grief that beauty was not enough, that brilliance alone did not guarantee remembrance. He could no longer read his own work, could no longer correct the things that had gone wrong. And in that helplessness, he heard echoes of music he never finished. Fragments that had lived only in his mind. Ideas too delicate to write down. Gone now, swallowed. He began humming them under his breath, as if the sound alone could trap them again. But even that faded. His voice, once confident, now quivered when it reached too high. And his hands, though they still knew the way to every chord, began trembling in the middle of scales. He did not cry, not where anyone could see. He just turned his face toward the sun that he could no longer see, and let the warmth pretend to be light. And when he prayed, it was not for healing. It was for memory. That something of him might remain in the spaces he had once filled. That one child would remember the way he counted the beats with a tap of his foot. That one stranger might play a fugue without knowing who had written it, but still feel the grief stitched into its seams. He lived like that, between silence and sound, between presence and retreat. And even as the world forgot, the music didn't. It stayed curled in corners, in pages, in pews, waiting for eyes that still saw, ears that still listened. And though he could not see them, he trusted they would come, because he had never written for glory, only for truth, only for God. His wife died, and the music didn't pause. The bed was already cold when he woke. Not because she had risen early, because she was gone, not drifted, not wandered. Gone in the way that has no return. She had been ill for weeks. Quietly, carefully, she hummed less, moved slower, folded clothes with hands that shook once the children looked away. But she still smiled when he passed her in the hall, still warmed his coffee even when her own cup sat untouched. She made space for his silence, held the house together with thread and patience, until one morning she simply did not wake. There was no scream, no final aria, just stillness where movement had always been. He sat at her bedside for hours, not because he didn't know what to do next, because he did, and he wasn't ready. The funeral was modest, too fast, the kind where people shuffle instead of weep. The children stood in pressed shirts and worn shoes, One daughter refused to look at the grave. A son asked if she would hear music in heaven. Bach did not answer. He went home and sat at the clavier, not out of discipline, out of compulsion. The music was still there, still forming in the corners of his mind, still begging to be written. He hated it for that it hadn't stopped, that it hadn't broken alongside him. He played anyway, not because he wanted to, because silence hurt more. He wrote a piece that night, soft, fragile, nothing anyone would commission. He did not title it, did not share it. He tucked it away in a drawer. She used to keep her linens. It smelled like her still, the lavender, the faint touch of flour from baking. He left the drawer open. The church expected a cantata by Sunday. He delivered it on time, clean, full of life. No one in the pews suspected, came from a house in mourning. No one asked, no one lingered. That was the world he lived in. A world that did not pause for death. A world that measured a man's worth by the pages he produced, not the ones he could no longer bear to read. He returned to the schoolroom, corrected mistakes, tuned instruments, practiced rhythms with boys too young to understand grief. He told no one that he still set 2 plates at the table some nights, or that he sometimes turned to speak to her in the dark before remembering she wasn't there. The children grew quieter. They followed his lead, and the house, once full of humming and footfalls and warmth, now echoed. He filled the echoes with music. It was all he could do. It did not comfort, it did not answer, but it moved, and movement in the absence of healing was the only thing that made the days bearable. So he kept writing. Even when the ink blurred, even when the candle burned low, even when the seat beside him stayed empty, the music didn't pause. So neither did he. They called him stubborn. He called it precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stopped the rehearsal and pointed to the bar. The choir had butchered for the 3rd time. Again, he said. The altos sighed. The tenors glanced at the door, but they sang it again and again and again, because he did not move forward until the music matched the shape he held in his head. He had written it perfectly. He knew what it should sound like. Every wrong note felt like grit in his teeth. They called him stubborn, whispered it when he walked past, said he demanded too much, expected too much, that he turned rehearsals into punishments and music into labor. But he heard none of it, or if he did, it didn't matter. He wasn't stubborn, he was precise. And precision in his world was love. Love for the craft, love for the God he composed for, love for the notes themselves, which deserved to live without sloppiness or excuse. He remembered being a child, copying scores by moonlight, his hands stiff with cold but his script unwavering. He had learned early that art did not bow to fatigue, it bowed to discipline. So when the soprano missed the entrance by a half beat, he didn't sigh. He tapped the stand and waited, again and again, until her breath aligned with the beat as if she had been born to it, until the music unfolded the way it had in his imagination, untouched by laziness or haste. They called it obsession. He called it truth, because he knew what it was to stand in the back of a sanctuary and hear a piece fall apart note by note. He knew the shame of being credited for something unfinished. He would not let it happen again. Even if it made him the most unpopular man in the building, he did not need them to admire him. He needed them to respect the work. He needed them to see what it cost to build beauty out of air. His children understood it. The ones who stayed. They watched him cross out whole pages when they watched him erase hours of work because a cadence did not resolve with enough grace. They never dared call it stubbornness. They called it what it was, standard. And even when his hands shook, even when his eyesight turned to blur, he still knew where every note should land. Not just on the page, in the heart. That was the mark of precision. that it did not fade with time, that it did not bend with fatigue, that it remained steady and unwelcome to anyone who had never held a calling too heavy to compromise. So when they sighed in rehearsals or rolled their eyes behind his back, he did not flinch. He simply lifted his hand, paused, and said again, because the music mattered more than their comfort. It always had. And that, to him, was not stubbornness. It was faithfulness. The manuscripts nobody wanted. Until he was gone, they sat in stacks in drawers, in trunks that creaked when opened, pages worn soft at the corners, ink faded, some unfinished, some copied twice. Others never touched by another hand but his. He had written them not for applause, but because they would not leave him alone. Music that pressed itself into his chest until he gave it shape. Some had been sung. Once, in churches where no one remembered the titles. Others had never left his study. No choir, no stage. Just him, bent over parchment by candlelight, while the city slept. When he showed them to patrons, they nodded politely and asked for something lighter, more fashionable. Something that would please the court or fill a gallery. These pieces, they said, were too dense, too long, too sacred. He folded the pages gently, said nothing, returned home, wrote more, because whether they listened or not, the sound remained. After his wife died, he wrote faster. After his eyesight failed, he dictated longer. The manuscripts grew, but the world around him did not pause to notice. His name faded from the lips of sponsors. Students came and went. Some stayed long enough to learn how to read his shorthand. Others left before learning how to listen. He stopped waiting for invitations. He stopped. The music was no longer a gift for others. It was shelter. It was the only part of him that remained untouched by grief. When he died, the city noted it in passing. The church bells rang, not loudly, not long. His children wept in silence. One son held his last manuscript like it was warm. Another packed the pages carefully, unsure where they would go. For a time they remained in boxes, moved from attic to cellar. Dust collected between staves. Names rubbed off the corners. Generations passed over them without reading a single note. And then something strange. A scholar found a piece in a forgotten archive, played it, felt something shift in the air. Not because it was pleasant, because it was honest. Word spread. Musicians began digging. One manuscript led to another. A theme reappeared in a work no one remembered. His name returned. First in footnotes, then on programs, then in breathless admiration. They called him a genius, a master of counterpoint. A mind centuries ahead of his time. They spoke of the depth, the complexity, the divine structure, and they played the pieces he once tucked away, thinking no one would ever understand them. They filled cathedrals, concert halls, classrooms. They taught his work as scripture, his forgotten pages, now bound in gold. But he wasn't there. He never heard the applause, never saw the reverence, never witnessed the world realize what they had let slip past. And maybe that's the lesson buried in the manuscripts. That greatness doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives quietly, alone, unopened, waiting for ears, not yet born to finally hear what heaven had whispered through his hands. What it felt like to die with a quill in your hand, it didn't happen in a church, or at a clavier, or surrounded by music. It happened at a table, quiet, plain, with parchment half filled and ink barely dry. The room was dim, the candle sputtering, the summer heat thick as wool. He had been dictating all morning, his voice hoarse, the windows open to let in a breeze that never came. His son sat nearby, pen poised, waiting for the next line. But it never came. Bach paused. not dramatically, just for a moment. A breath between thoughts, then another, then longer. Then his hand went still on the table, not clenched, not curled, just resting, the quill still pressed between his fingers. He had held it so long that it felt more natural than his own skin. It didn't fall. It simply, not like thunder, not like brilliance, like stopping, like breath held in the throat of a room. No final word, no amen, just silence. The same silence he had filled with music his entire life. He didn't cry out, didn't say goodbye. He had already said what mattered in notes. They lay scattered on the desk, half written, half finished, and yet complete in the way only unfinished things can be. His son didn't shout, just leaned forward, touched his shoulder, and knew the silence wasn't rehearsal, knew the page would not be finished by its author, knew the quill had drawn its last line. The city did not weep that day. No great bells tolled for the composer's hand. The world outside went on in its errands, and noise and sunlight. But inside that small room, something vast ended without fanfare. His body would be buried quietly, without choirs, without the works he had given his life to. The ink on his fingertips would fade. The paper would yellow. It hovered in the walls, in the room, in the breath of his son who still sat there, afraid to move, afraid the moment would break if he exhaled too loudly. And the quill, what of it? It would be lifted from his fingers gently, dried, placed in a drawer, not as a relic, as a memory, of the man who didn't stop until the music did, of the soul who died not in bitterness, but in motion, mid-thought, mid-prayer, mid-gift. What did it feel like to die with a quill in your hand, like returning the last piece of yourself to the silence you'd borrowed from, not unfinished, not undone, just offered back quietly, the way all true music ends. The church is empty, but the notes are still there. The doors creak louder now than they used to. Dust rests where sunlight once landed like stained glass fire. The pews are lined with silence, not the kind that invites prayer, the kind that forgets what it came to hear. No candles flicker, no choir shuffles pages. The altar cloth hangs limp, and yet the notes are still here. They echo in places the eye doesn't see. They hide in the beams above the nave, in the places where his voice used to rise over the heads of sleepy parishioners and stubborn sopranos. No one sings them aloud anymore, but the walls remember, the floorboards remember, the air remembers. Sometimes late in the day, when the sun leans just right through the tall windows and the dust dances slow, you can almost hear it. A fragment of a fugue, a line from a lost cantata, a rhythm tapping against time. The music was written to outlive him. He knew it. That was why he never rushed the endings, why he rewrote what others would have let stand. He didn't care for the applause. He cared that the notes held together long after the applause stopped, and now they do. There is no choir, no audience, but they still live. In the quiet of an unused chapel, in the cracked spine of an old hymnal, in the hands of a janitor who hums a line he does not know the name of, in a child tapping on a bench that once held Bach himself. The world moved on. It always does. Tastes changed. Courts changed. Languages changed, but not the notes. Not the way they enter a room like breath and stay there long after. The breath is gone. Sometimes a traveller wanders in, sits in the back, feels something they can't name. A stillness, a structure, a memory that isn't theirs. They don't know who built it. They don't know what's missing. But they know something remains, something that did not die with the man who once walked these aisles, muttering motifs under his breath. The organ is silent now, but the keys are only sleeping. The pages in the vestry are yellowed but legible. His handwriting still marks the margins. His fingerprints still linger. And above all, the notes wait. Not bitterly, not with pride, just with patience, because true music doesn't beg to be heard. It knows someone someday will come looking for it, and when they do, the church won't feel so empty. It will open its wooden mouth and sing again, as if it never stopped. So now you know, not the legend, not the marble bust or the scholarly analysis, but the man, the father who kept writing when the candles ran out, the husband who buried music beside grief, the teacher who demanded more because he heard more, the blind composer who never stopped seeing with his soul. Johann Sebastian Bach didn't chase fame. He chased truth in sound. He didn't write to be remembered. He wrote because silence was never enough. And even now, centuries later, you don't need to know his name to feel what he left behind. It's in the ache of a cello line, in the whisper of organ pipes, in the echo that follows a final chord and lingers longer than breath. That's where he is. That's where he always was. And when you listen, really listen, you'll hear it. Not just the notes, but the man, tired, devoted, unshakably precise, holding a quill in the dark, writing what heaven handed him. So sleep now if you can. Let the music do what it always did. Wrap around your thoughts, soothe what's restless. Remind you that the most beautiful things are often born in quiet places where no one is watching, where the heart writes first,